Hi everyone, it's Clarice, and today I'm going to talk about the graphic non-fiction books I recently read. I hesitate to call them graphic novels because they aren't novels if they aren't fiction, right? But anyway, coincidentally, every single one of the books I'm going to mention to you today have some diverse elements to them, which is always great. So the first book I'm going to talk about today is The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage by Sidney Padua. I wasn't actually sure what to classify this as because it is based on non-fiction, though it has some fictional comic strips in it, but I feel like it's mostly non-fiction, so I would consider it non-fiction. But generally, it follows two people. Charles Babbage over here is the man behind the difference engine, which is a machine that could have been the first computer if only he'd ever gotten around to building it. Ada, Countess of Lovelace over here, is a young mathematician that helped Charles Babbage with his research and actually was the woman who wrote the very first computer programs about a century before the first computer was even built. This book tells us about actual things that happen in their lives, while also featuring comic strips that are placed in a pocket universe wherein Charles Babbage was able to actually build the difference engine and Ada Lovelace hadn't died young. So we're able to follow their fictional adventures with the difference engine while also reading extremely long footnotes explaining things that actually happen in their life and actual concepts behind the difference engine and how it worked. I honestly couldn't stop smiling while I read this book. As a computer science major, I was amused by the concepts that were mentioned here that I did know, but also by the concepts here that I didn't know anything about. And also because of my major and because I specialize in software, I felt that I could relate to Ada Lovelace a lot, at least in specific moments. She was like the first programmer ever. Like Charles Babbage did the hardware and she did the software, and just being able to see that the first person that was in my field was possibly a woman, it's just so inspiring and just so nice being able to see it. It just made me so happy. Like I said, this book just makes me so happy. Aside from that, you could also see how much research and effort the author put into writing this book. You could feel her fascination with these concepts and with these people through the pages. But even for people who aren't so familiar with computer concepts, this book is just so charming. The drawings were adorable, the characters were quirky, the humor was my type of humor, and as I said, I just couldn't stop smiling. As soon as I finished this, I knew that it was a personal favorite of mine, though I feel like it's hard to recommend just because a lot of the reasons I loved it was because of my field and what I'm studying. That being said though, I think you would still really enjoy this, especially if you enjoy sci-fi or just really fascinating books. I don't think you need to be a computer science major to be fascinated by how the difference engine works or to appreciate adorable little nerdy comic strips. Also, as I mentioned, all the books in this video are diverse, and Ada Lovelace, along with her father Lord Byron, were actually believed to be bipolar. From a young age up to, I suppose, her death, Ada Lovelace was discouraged from anything that was considered poetical to prevent her from suffering from the same madness that her father did. And they're trying to prevent her from becoming like her father was actually why mathematics was pushed on her as hard as it was. So if after all of that, this sounds like the sort of book you'd enjoy, I highly recommend it because I loved it so much. The next book, or books, I'm going to talk about are Persepolis 1 and 2, or The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I'm sure you've already heard of this book, but in case you haven't, Persepolis is a memoir about Marjane's life during the Islamic Revolution, about her growing up, about her moving around, and about her, I guess, finding herself. As expected, I really enjoyed this. I loved learning about the culture that surrounded Marjane as she grew up, and was heartbroken by some of the struggles that she, her family, and I guess her country in general had to face during this time of war. I also enjoyed not only reading about the events in Marjane's life, but also just hearing her thoughts about politics and also about feminism. Even at a young age, clearly she was already a rebel. I read this because of my goal this year to read the world and to try to learn from other people's cultures and experiences and perspectives through it. And I feel like if some of your reading goals are similar to that I definitely recommend that you read this book because it was definitely an eye-opener to me. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Fifth Beatle by Vivek J. Tiwari, Andrew C. Robinson, and Kyle Baker. This is the story of Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, and also a homosexual at a time when it was illegal to be so. It's a bit of a story about how the Beatles got started, but it's mainly a story about Brian Epstein and all of the struggles that he went through. Before I get to my thoughts on the story, I just want to say the art in here is fantastic. I especially love the coloring of it. It's just done so well, and I really enjoyed looking at this book. But I also enjoyed reading it, of course. So on to the story. The Fifth Beatle didn't give me all the explicit details of Brian Epstein's life or of the beginning of the Beatles, but what it did give me was kind of an overview or a full picture of what his life was and the things that he struggled with, even though some of the sections were left kind of open and a bit vague, and I had to read it over again to see if I could understand it properly. And I may have to read this book again just to see if I can understand it better this time around, because as I said, it's not super explicit in its details. But in spite of that, it was a book that I just really felt. Like, I got more emotional over this book than I expected to. I didn't cry or anything, but for a book to make me feel emotional, that's always a good thing. Unless it's anger over how bad the book is, but you know what I mean. I overall really enjoyed this book, even though I had to go over a couple of parts twice. But again, I really enjoyed reading it, I really enjoyed looking at it, and I'm really glad that it's a story that exists, and I'm glad that it was a story that was finally told. Side note though, they did mention in this book at one point a time when they visited the Philippines and things went really terribly, which is a shame. If only they'd gone at a different time. As if I'd need another reason to hate the Marcos dictatorship. They made the Beatles hate our country. But anyway, in terms of recommending this book, I definitely recommend it, though you shouldn't go into it expecting to learn about all the fun facts about how the Beatles got started and that sort of thing, because it doesn't, again, go into too many details. So if you do want an emotional, true story about Brian Epstein's struggles at this time, and if this sounds interesting to you at all, I definitely recommend that you read it. It also doesn't hurt that the art is absolutely beautiful. The next graphic non-fiction book that I read was Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which I'm sure most of you already know about. It won the Pulitzer, but it's a book that follows Art Spiegelman as he interviews his father about all the things that his father went through during the Holocaust. This book was so good, I don't feel like I'm going to be able to say much about it because I enjoyed it so much. You know, when you read about the Holocaust on the internet or in books or that sort of thing, you know, you're devastated but you don't really feel it. But reading about it in Mouse and being able to hear the account of someone that was actually there, about hearing his personal experiences and about the experiences of the people around him, it just makes it feel so much more real. And I'm so glad that I read this book, but this book also made me just so distressed and emotional while I was reading it. So overall, I definitely recommend this book, and I see why it won the Pulitzer. I see why so many people regard it so highly, and I'm really glad that I read it, and I'm so glad that it's a book that exists. And the last book I'm going to talk about today is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. And it's a story about Alison's childhood, about growing up and trying to understand herself and her identity, and then later on coming out to her family about it. But it's also a story about her father, who is someone that, unlike Alison, was never really able to properly come out or be able to properly accept his own identity as a homosexual for who he was. And this book, like so many of the other books I mentioned today, was just so eye-opening because you're able to see the parallels in Alison's and her father's life, and also a lot of the contrast, you know, seeing Alison being able to come to terms with who she is, but also being able to see her father never really being able to come to terms with who he is because of the society he grew up in, and being able to see the sort of repercussions on his own self and on the people around him. You could hear Alison talking about how important it was to have books that explored homosexuality and that sort of thing, and that helped her a lot with finding herself. And so I'm really glad that her book exists so that it can help other people. And it also highlights how important promoting diverse books is, how important being able to see yourself in books is. It was really nice being able to read about that. So those are all the graphic non-fiction books I recently read. Clearly, due to personal bias, my favorite of all of them is The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage, though I thoroughly enjoyed every single one of them, as you could probably tell. Have you read any of these books, and what are your thoughts on them? Or have you read any other graphic non-fiction books recently that you think I should check out? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!